I read the headline the same way you probably did, with that instinctive mix of curiosity and skepticism that comes whenever a financial story promises a historic collapse. Saudi Arabia dumps the dollar is the sort of phrasing that seems engineered to suggest immediate catastrophe. Yet beneath that surface, beneath the adrenaline of the headline and the panic of the ticker tape, there is a quieter and far more consequential story that most people missed. It is a story not about a currency crashing, but about a contract expiring. It is a story about how nations understand their own security, about the long arc of institutional memory, and about what happens when a country once defined by its reliance on a superpower decides to diversify its portfolio of survival. You saw the clips. You heard the pundits shouting about the death of the dollar, but what you may not have seen is the deeper geopolitical realignment taking shape behind Riyadh's announcement. My task is to walk you through that hidden layer, not to amplify the fear of inflation, but to illuminate the structure beneath it. What officially happened is straightforward enough. Saudi Arabia made a declaration that it is now open to settling oil trades in currencies other than the US dollar, specifically the Chinese Yuan and the Indian rupee. What struck me, and what likely struck you, even if you could not yet articulate it, was how the announcement did not sound like a declaration of war. It sounded like a business decision. For 50 years, the global economic strategy has been understood in relation to the petrodollar. This was not merely a currency arrangement, it was the nervous system of the global economy. It was shaped by the gravitational pull of American military protection and the stability of American demand. When the United States was the guarantor of Middle Eastern security, that monopoly on currency was the price of admission. When the U.S. Navy patrolled the Straits of Hormuz, the Saudis paid in loyalty and liquidity. But what made this moment so unusual is that Saudi Arabia signaled it no longer intends to tie its long-term financial planning to that single point of failure. To understand how we arrived here, you have to consider the slow accumulation of pressures that have reshaped the incentives of modern governance. Nations rarely rethink their economic foundation spontaneously. They do it when the cost of maintaining the familiar becomes greater than the cost of building something new. The last decade has delivered a series of lessons to the kingdom. American foreign policy has become volatile, energy markets have fractured, and the definition of security has shifted from military hardware to economic resilience. If you are a Saudi policymaker watching these developments, you eventually confront a question that is not ideological but practical. Should the value of your primary export depend on the interest rate decisions of a Federal Reserve you cannot influence? That question, perhaps more than any immediate diplomatic dispute, is what pushed Riyadh toward the moment we are discussing now. The mechanics, when you strip away the rhetoric, come down to the slow but deliberate construction of alternatives. Financial dependence is not undone by a press release. It is undone by establishing new clearing mechanisms, new banking relationships, and the kind of diplomatic strategy that takes years to assemble. What Saudi Arabia revealed is not merely a preference for the yuan, but an institutional blueprint for a post-American Middle East. It involves diversified customers, diversified assets, and the recognition that sovereignty is expressed not through buying American weapons, but through the quiet ability to sell your oil to whomever you want, in whatever currency they possess. You might feel that this is obvious, yet it is only obvious in hindsight. The monopoly of the dollar is comfortable until it is not, and institutions tend to cling to comfort until a shock forces them to reconsider, which brings us to the concept of the petrodollar itself. It is tempting to attribute the endurance of the dollar solely to the strength of the American economy, and certainly the depth of U.S. markets played a role, but institutions respond to incentives, not just market cap. When a country, especially a massive energy exporter, adopts a posture of financial neutrality, its partners look not at the currency, but at the system that allows such neutrality to exist. The Saudis saw a pattern, not an outburst. They saw a political environment in the United States that increasingly viewed the oil industry as a relic or a climate enemy. They saw a Washington that was becoming an energy competitor rather than a client, and they asked themselves whether a nation of their ambition could afford to keep all their chips in a casino owned by their competition. The answer increasingly was no. Yet the consequences of this decision extend far beyond the realm of forex markets. They touch on how global trade is settled, how sanctions are enforced, and how citizens in the West make sense of a world in which their currency is no longer the automatic default for global commerce. You may not work in finance or energy or logistics, but the institutions that govern those sectors shape the cost of the life you inhabit. When a nation as central to the energy trade as Saudi Arabia reorganizes its economic foundations, it inevitably reorganizes the expectations of the entire global market. Saudi Arabia is signaling that the old assumption that the United States is the fixed sun around which the energy universe orbits may no longer hold. Whether you agree with that shift or fear its economic fallout, it is a significant recalibration of global power. The human element is easy to overlook when conversations drift into the language of reserve currencies and balance of payments. But behind every policy choice are consumers, drivers, and homeowners who depend on stable prices. For the average American, this shift is not an abstract gesture of diplomatic defiance. It is a warning sign about the future purchasing power of their money. Some will see it as a betrayal by a long-time ally. Others will worry it introduces new inflationary risks. Both reactions are understandable. Nations, like people, navigate trade-offs. I want to leave you for now with a reflection that sits above the political fray. This moment reveals the tension at the heart of modern governance, the desire for autonomy in a world built on financial centralization. Saudi Arabia is not rejecting the dollar entirely. It is renegotiating its dominance, and it is doing so at a time when many emerging economies are reconsidering how to protect themselves from the weaponization of finance without isolating themselves from Western markets. That balance is difficult, and no single announcement resolves it. But this is one of those inflection points where you can sense the architecture of the financial order shifting, even if the collapse is not imminent. As we step further into the mechanics of this shift, I want you to picture something less dramatic than a stock market crash and far more consequential. A nation quietly adjusting the gears of the global energy machinery. That is what Saudi Arabia has begun to do, not by burning the dollar, but by designing a system that reduces the need for it. If you think about institutions the way I often encourage you to, slow-moving, inertia-bound, shaped more by incentives than by impulses, you begin to see why this moment carries such weight. Saudi Arabia is not walking away from the West. It is walking toward a version of itself that does not rely on the goodwill or predictability of Washington. And that distinction, though subtle, is the entire story. What enabled this and what is still enabling it is a confluence of long-term trends that make institutional recalibration not only possible but prudent. You see it in the rise of the Asian consumer class, in the digitization of currency, in the way economic stability now hinges on multipolarity more than on American hegemony. When the volatility of the hegemon becomes predictable, client states adapt. For Saudi Arabia, adaptation meant treating the United States not as a protector but as a partner among many. To understand why this decoupling is happening now, we have to look back at the contract that is being dismantled. It was not written on parchment in a grand hall, but verbally agreed upon on the deck of a cruiser, the USS Quincy, in the waning days of World War II. President Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz sat together and forged a simple, durable deal. The United States would provide unconditional security to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In exchange, the kingdom would ensure the free flow of oil to the West, priced exclusively in U.S. dollars. For nearly 80 years, that handshake governed the metabolism of the world. It was a marriage of convenience, certainly, but it was a stable one. However, contracts rely on the premise that both parties still need what the other is offering. What you might not have realized, because the change happened slowly, is that the United States quietly filed for divorce over a decade ago. It didn't do so with a diplomatic letter, but with a technological revolution. The shale oil boom in Texas and the Dakotas fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of Washington. Suddenly, for the first time in history, the United States was not desperate for Saudi oil. In fact, the United States became the world's largest oil producer, a direct competitor to the very kingdom it was sworn to protect. If you are a strategist in Riyadh, you look at this new reality and you see a glaring flaw in the old arrangement. Why should you price your product in the currency of your competitor? Why should you outsource your security to a nation that no longer relies on your supply? The incentives that held the Quincy Agreement together have evaporated. The United States, once the insatiable customer, is now the rival, and when your protector becomes your competitor, the logic of the alliance begins to crumble. This is not about emotions, it is about the cold math of national interest. The Saudis realized that the security guarantee was effectively void the moment America became energy independent. We saw this play out in real time, though many missed the significance of the events. When Iranian-backed drones struck the Abqaiq oil processing facility in 2019, temporarily knocking out half of Saudi Arabia's oil production, the response from Washington was muted. There was no grand mobilization, no retaliatory strike. For the Saudis, This was the moment the veil lifted. It was the proof that the security umbrella had holes in it. They realized then that they were alone in a dangerous neighborhood and that the Petrodollar was a premium they were paying for an insurance policy that no longer paid out. This realization coincided with a shift in American political temperament. The United States began to leverage its financial system as a tool of foreign policy more aggressively than ever before. Sanctions, asset freezes, and exclusion from the SCUF-T banking system became the primary weapons of American power. While these tools were effective against adversaries, they sent a chilling message to allies and neutrals alike. The dollar is not a neutral utility, it is a political leash. If you cross Washington, your money is no longer your money. For a monarchy like Saudi Arabia, which prizes stability above all else, this politicization of the dollar represented an unacceptable risk. They looked at what happened to Russia's central bank assets, billions of dollars seized overnight, and saw a ghost of their own potential future. It was a lesson in vulnerability. If the United States could seize the assets of a nuclear power, what could it do to a desert kingdom? This fear, more than any economic ambition, drove the search for alternatives. The decision to accept yuan is not about a love for China. It is about creating a buffer against American wrath. You might feel that such realism borders on cynicism, yet it is actually an act of institutional survival. Democracies that endure learn to insulate themselves from the emotional turbulence of politics, but monarchies must plan in decades, not 4-year terms. The actors involved in this transformation are not only the princes you see on television. Behind them are sovereign wealth fund managers, oil market analysts, and strategic planners who have spent years modeling the decline of American influence. These are the people who look at trends rather than press conferences, who understand that dependence on a single currency creates a single point of failure. If you rely too heavily on one partner, every shift in their behavior becomes existential. Saudi Arabia's pivot is at its core an effort to remove the existential element from its economic relationship with the United States. It is a way of saying that the alliance is valuable, but the dependency is dangerous. This realignment also forces us to confront an uncomfortable but necessary truth about the modern energy market. The center of gravity has shifted. In 1945, the West consumed the oil. Today, the East consumes it. China and India are now the primary clients of the Gulf. It defies basic economic logic to sell your product to your biggest customer, China, but price it in the currency of your biggest rival, the USA. It introduces friction and exchange rate risk that serves no commercial purpose. By moving to settlement in yuan or rupees, the Saudis are merely aligning the financial architecture of the trade with the physical reality of the trade. They are cutting out the middleman. And when the middleman is the United States dollar, that cut represents billions in lost demand for the greenback. The United States is not being punished. It is being bypassed. You may find that reframing unsettling, as it suggests a loss of American primacy, but it reflects the logic of a world where markets are ruthless in their pursuit of efficiency. The petrodollar was an inefficiency that the world tolerated because the U.S. provided a service security. Now that the service is degraded, the fee is being renegotiated. The consequences of this shift reach beyond the oil fields. They signal to every other commodity producer, from Brazilian soy farmers to Indonesian nickel miners, that the dollar is optional. When a country as pivotal as Saudi Arabia breaks the mold, it creates a permission structure for others to follow. It tells the global South that they can trade amongst themselves without routing every transaction through New York. This is the hidden layer I spoke of earlier. It is not just about oil. It is about the dismantling of the centralized financial network that has governed the world since Bretton Woods. It is the beginning of a decentralized, fragmented financial order where no single currency rules. We must now look closely at the new architecture being built, because it is not simply a matter of swapping one paper currency for another. It is about infrastructure. When Saudi Arabia agrees to accept the Petroyuan, it is integrating itself into a financial ecosystem that China has spent 20 years constructing. You have to understand that for Beijing, this is not just an economic victory, it is a strategic necessity. China knows that as long as it buys oil in dollars, its energy security is at the mercy of the U.S. Treasury. One signature in Washington could freeze their ability to pay for the fuel that powers their economy. So, this is a convergence of anxieties. Saudi Arabia is anxious about the reliability of American security. China is anxious about the weaponization of the American dollar. These two anxieties have met and produced a solution, a trade loop that bypasses the Western banking system entirely. They are using the cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS. China's alternative to SQFT. This is the plumbing that most people never see, but it is where the real power lies. By settling trades on these new rails, they are creating a dark pool of global commerce, a zone of economic activity that is invisible to American regulators and immune to American sanctions. You might be thinking, but the yuan is not a free currency, it is controlled by the Communist Party. And you would be right. This is the skepticism I mentioned at the start. The Saudis are not naive. They know that trading one master for another is not freedom. That is why this story is not about replacing the dollar with the yuan. It is about using the yuan as a transactional tool, not a store of value. The Saudis are not planning to keep billions of yuan in a vault in Riyadh. They are using it to pay for the massive construction projects involved in Vision 2030, which are largely being built by Chinese construction firms. This is the circular economy of the New East. Saudi oil flows to China, Chinese yuan flows to Saudi Arabia. That yuan is then paid back to Chinese contractors to build futuristic cities like Neom. The dollar is nowhere to be found in this loop. It has been disintermediated. For the viewer trying to understand why this matters, consider the implications for the exorbitant privilege the U.S. has enjoyed for decades. Because the world needed dollars to buy oil, the world had to buy U.S. debt. This allowed the U.S. government to borrow cheaply and run massive deficits without immediate consequences. If the demand for dollars in the energy market softens, the demand for U.S. Treasury bonds softens. And if that demand softens, the interest rates on U.S. debt must rise to attract buyers. This is where the geopolitics hits your wallet. The mortgage rates in Arizona or the car loans in Michigan are indirectly subsidized by the global demand for the dollar. If that demand fractures, the cost of being American goes up. This is the invisible subsidy that the petrodollar system provided, and it is the subsidy that is now being eroded. But we must also look at India's role here because it further proves that this is not an anti-American bloc, but a pro-transaction bloc. India is a strategic partner of the United States, yet it too is buying Russian and Saudi oil in non-dollar currencies. Why? Because the price is right and the mechanism works. This reveals the weakness of the ideological view of global markets. Nations do not trade based on whether they like each other's constitutions. They trade based on price, reliability, and ease. The U.S. utilized the dollar as a moral cudgel, forcing nations to align with its foreign policy to access the market. The reaction from the world has been to build a market that requires no moral alignment. The Saudi strategy is to position itself as the central bank of energy, a neutral broker that accepts all currencies. This is a return to a more historical form of mercantilism. It is a rejection of the universal values that the U.S. tried to attach to its currency. The message from Riyadh is clear: our oil is a commodity, not a vote for your geopolitical worldview. If you have the money, whether it is rupees, yuan, or gold, you get the oil. This neutrality is the new asset class. In a polarized world, the ability to talk to everyone is more valuable than being allied with the strongest player. We also cannot overlook the technological dimension. The rise of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, is accelerating this trend. The Petroyuan is likely to become a digital token, programmable and instant. This removes the friction of correspondent banking that the U.S. controls. It makes the trade faster, cheaper, and harder to track. Saudi Arabia and China are piloting these exchanges now. They are testing the pipes, and once the pipes are proven to work, the volume will increase. This is the phase of proof of concept. The volume of non-dollar oil trade is still small compared to the total global market, but trends start at the margins. The first electric cars were dismissed as toys. Now they are reshaping the auto industry. The first non-dollar oil trades are being dismissed as symbolic. They will reshape the financial industry. You as a citizen observing this might recognize that such choices rarely happen at the moment of crisis. They happen after years of observing the same pattern and realizing the pattern has become the problem. That is why when Saudi Arabia announced this shift, it did not sound reactive. It sounded prepared. Preparedness is the hallmark of institutional seriousness. It means that behind the scenes, Saudi planners were mapping out how to recycle these new currencies. They were negotiating swap lines with the People's Bank of China. They were crafting policies that could win domestic support by promising that this diversification would fund the diversification of the economy itself. When you view the moment through that lens, it stops looking like a diplomatic spat and starts looking like a mature nation securing its supply lines. This clarity also allows us to look more honestly at the role of the United States. It is tempting to view American financial power as an immutable fact of life. Yet power that rests on the assumption of lack of choice is fragile. The United States has long benefited from being the only game in town, but new casinos have opened. The United States is still the biggest and most liquid market, but it is no longer the only one. Saudi Arabia's recalibration does not destroy the dollar. Rather, it exposes a truth the United States has not always acknowledged, that influence derived from coercion is self-defeating. It invites partners to search for trapdoors, and when trapdoors are found, they are used. To fully grasp the magnitude of this decision, we must step inside the mind of the Saudi leadership and understand the domestic pressure cooker that is driving it. The headline story is about oil, but the real story is about the post-oil future. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has staked his entire legitimacy on Vision 2030, a massive trillion-dollar transformation plan designed to turn the kingdom from a gas station into a global investment powerhouse, a tourism hub, and a technology center. This is not just a vanity project, it is an existential necessity. The Saudi population is young, and the oil wealth, while vast, is not infinite. To succeed, the kingdom needs massive amounts of foreign direct investment, technology transfer, and open trade routes to the fastest-growing markets. And where are those markets? They are in the East. They are not in the West. Europe is stagnation. The United States is mature. Asia is the engine. It makes zero strategic sense to tie the financing of your future to the stagnation of the West when the growth is happening in the East. The move to accept alternative currencies is, therefore, a tool of domestic development. By accepting yuan, Saudi Arabia encourages Chinese companies to set up factories in the kingdom. It creates a sticky economic relationship. If a Chinese firm pays for oil in yuan, and the Saudi government offers that firm contracts to build railways in Jeddah payable in yuan, you have created a closed-loop economy that benefits both sides. It brings jobs and technology to Saudi Arabia in a way that simply hoarding U.S. Treasury bonds never did. This is a crucial point that is often missed in the geopolitical analysis. The petrodollar system involved Saudi Arabia recycling its surpluses into U.S. debt that helped the U.S. economy, but it didn't build factories in Riyadh. The Petroyuan system involves recycling surpluses into domestic infrastructure. It is a shift from financial investment in America to industrial investment in Arabia. If you are a young Saudi entering the workforce, this shift matters. It means your government is prioritizing your job prospects over the stability of the U.S. bond market. This aligns with a broader trend we call sovereign development. Nations are realizing that true sovereignty requires more than a flag and an army. It requires the control of your own economic destiny. If your economy crashes because the U.S. Federal Reserve raises rates to fight inflation in Ohio, you are not sovereign. You are a colony with a flag. Saudi Arabia is attempting to break the colonial dynamic. They are building what I call a sovereign shield, a financial structure that allows them to pursue their own national interest regardless of the winds blowing from Washington. You might feel that this is a dangerous gamble, and it is. The United States is a jealous superpower. There are risks of backlash, congressional bills to pull military support, lawsuits regarding OPEC price fixing or reduced intelligence sharing. But the Saudis have calculated that the risk of staying in the old system is higher than the risk of breaking it. They believe the U.S. needs them for counter-terrorism, for containing Iran, for stabilizing global energy prices. Too much to completely abandon them. It is a calculated bet on their own indispensability. And notice the tone of the Saudi response to U.S. criticism. It is not apologetic, it is transactional. We are looking after our interests, they say. This language of interests is the new lingua franca of the multipolar world. It replaces the language of values or alliances. It is colder, harder, and more predictable. The Saudis are effectively saying to the U.S., you are welcome to compete for our business. If you offer better terms, better security, better technology, we will trade with you, but we will no longer grant you a monopoly based on nostalgia. This psychological shift is perhaps the most profound part of the story. For decades, the Gulf monarchies had a psychology of dependence. They viewed themselves as vulnerable states that needed a protector. Now they view themselves as middle powers with agency. They host peace talks for Ukraine. They mediate prisoner swaps. They negotiate with Iran. The currency decision is just the financial expression of this new political confidence. They are acting like a G20 power, not a protectorate. As you digest this, think about what it means for the concept of the West. For a long time, we assumed that modernization meant westernization. We assumed that as countries got rich, they would become more like us, more democratic, more aligned with the dollar, more integrated into our institutions. Saudi Arabia and China and India is proving that modernization can happen without westernization. They are adopting our technology and our financial tools, but rejecting our political oversight. The petrodollar was the ultimate symbol of that oversight. It was the tool that allowed the U.S. to regulate the metabolic rate of the world economy. By losing the exclusivity of that tool, the U.S. loses a degree of control that it can never regain. It is a moment of imperial recession, not a collapse, but a receding of the tide. The Saudis are building seawalls to ensure that when the American tide goes out, their economy doesn't dry up. This leads us to the question of responsibility. Who is responsible for the stability of the global energy market now? It used to be Washington. Now, it is a committee. It is OPEC led by Saudi Arabia and Russia interacting with consumers in Beijing and New Delhi. It is a messy, multipolar world. And for the viewer, this means that the price of gas at the pump is now determined by a complex web of interactions that no single capital controls. The predictability of the American era is gone. The complexity of the multipolar era has arrived. We have traced the arc from the deck of the USS Quincy to the digital ledgers of the Petroyuan. Now, we must bring this narrative home to your doorstep. Why should you, as a citizen potentially living thousands of miles from the Arabian desert, care about the currency in which a barrel of crude oil is invoiced? You should care because the stability of your own currency is tied to this distant machinery. The dollar's global dominance has been the invisible infrastructure of American prosperity. It has allowed the U.S. to import goods cheaply, borrow money cheaply, and project power cheaply. When Saudi Arabia chips away at that dominance, they are not just changing a billing system. They are introducing competition to the U.S. dollar. And when a monopoly faces competition, its margins get squeezed. For the U.S., this means the margin of error in economic policy will shrink. The government will have to be more disciplined. It will not be able to print money with the same abandon, knowing that the world has no choice but to absorb it. The world now has a choice. This imposes a discipline on Washington that voters have been unable to impose at the ballot box. You might find that prospect frightening or refreshing. If you are a saver, a stronger, more disciplined dollar might be good. If you are a borrower or a government relying on cheap debt, it will be painful. But either way, it reflects the reality of a world where the United States must compete for its status rather than inherit it. The era of exorbitant privilege is transitioning into an era of earned privilege. The U.S. must now prove that the dollar is the best currency, not just the only one. This moment also reveals something significant about the health of democratic institutions in general. Democracies thrive when they can deliver stability, but in a globalized world, they cannot deliver stability alone. They need partners. The U.S.-Saudi rift shows what happens when a democracy takes a partner for granted. It shows that foreign policy is not a separate sphere from domestic economics. The rhetoric used on the campaign trail, calling nations pariahs, has a cost. It alienates the partners you need to keep your own economy stable. Saudi Arabia's shift is a mirror reflecting American volatility back at us. It is telling us that our internal political chaos, our debt ceiling fights, our swinging foreign policy pendulum has made us an unreliable anchor. The world is looking for stability, and if they cannot find it in the dollar, they will build it themselves. This is not a hostile act, it is a rational one. It is the global equivalent of a homeowner buying a generator because the power grid keeps failing. As I conclude, I want you to picture the future not as a disaster movie, but as a complex, shifting mosaic. The dollar will not vanish. It will remain a powerful, perhaps the most powerful, currency for our lifetimes. But it will sit alongside others. We are moving toward a currency Cold War, where trade blocs use their own monies to insulate themselves. The West will trade in dollars and euros. The East will trade in yuan, rupees, and gold. And in the middle, nations like Saudi Arabia will act as the switchboard operators, connecting these two worlds and profiting from the flow. This is the new texture of sovereignty. It is less about borders and more about connectivity. Saudi Arabia is declaring independence from the single wire connection to the U.S. and splicing itself into the global grid. For you, the viewer, this means living in a world that is more expensive, perhaps, but also more honest. The subsidies of the empire are ending. The true cost of energy, of debt, and of defense is becoming visible. You may feel that the ground is moving beneath your feet. It is. But it is not a collapse. It is an adjustment. A recognition that the post-Dedollarization order was an anomaly, a brief moment where one nation held up the sky. That moment is over. The sky is now being held up by many pillars, some of them strange to us, some of them rivals to us. But the architecture is changing, and we must understand it to navigate it. Canada showed us how a neighbor recalibrates. Saudi Arabia is showing us how a client state emancipates itself. These are the trimmers of a new century. The petrodollar is not dead, but the petrodollar system, the monopoly, the exclusivity, the weaponization is over, and in its place rises something more fragmented, more competitive, and endlessly more complex. What do you believe true national resilience requires in a world where your currency is no longer the king? Your answer to that question shapes not only how you view this moment, but how you understand the future of your own economy. The oil trade is not over, but the terms of the trade have changed forever. And as always, the most important story is not the one shouting in the headlines, but the one quietly rewriting the rules of the game while everyone is looking the other way. If you found this discussion helpful in seeing through the noise, I invite you to join us next time as we continue to map the hidden layers of this new world.